The subcommittee on cybersecurity, infrastructure protection, and innovation will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittee, let me move forward. Good afternoon, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today to discuss how we can respond to the ransomware crisis. I first chaired this subcommittee over 10 years ago. While ransomware is not a new problem, the number of cases and the financial impact has skyrocketed since then. That's why I wanted to focus on ransomware at our first subcommittee hearing this year. We must understand the problem we're facing, learn more about how the federal government should respond, and do something. Estimates show that ransomware victims paid $350 million in ransom payments last year. Among those victims were 2,400 US-based governments, healthcare facilities, and schools. As the COVID-19 pandemic forced governments and businesses to shift to remote work, thousands found themselves locked out of their networks as cyber criminals demanded ransom payments. These attacks are more than a mere inconvenience. They are a national security threat. It is time for bold action rooted in robust partnerships between the federal government and its state, local, and private sector partners. In the coming days, I will introduce the State and Local Cybersecurity Improvement Act, which would authorize $500 million in annual grants to state, local, territorial, and tribal governments to strengthen their cybersecurity. As the ever-increasing number of ransomware attacks on states and local governments demonstrates, adequate treatment in the cybersecurity has been lacking and more resources are needed. Just last week, we saw some ransomware attacks that released sensitive law enforcement information from police departments in Washington, D.C., in Presque Isle, Maine, showing that cities, large and small, are vulnerable to this type of cybercrime. This legislation would ensure funding is available while insisting state and local governments step up to prioritize cybersecurity in their own budgets. I'm proud of the bipartisan support this bill has received on this committee and looking forward to working with Ranking Member Garbarino, along with Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Katko to get this critical bill enacted. I hope this hearing will give us an opportunity to learn more about the challenges state chief information officers face under current funding constraints and how they'd be able to use additional resources to strengthen their defenses to ransomware. And while state and local governments are some of the most notable victims of ransomware, this crisis affects many private businesses in the United States and around the world. Combating this threat will require coordination between the public and private sectors and all levels of government. The Ransomware Task Force report released last week provided 48 recommendations on what government and industry can do to address this crisis in the coming months and years. And I'm excited to have two of those co-chairs of the task force here today to share more information on the recommendations. As Secretary Mayorkas has made clear in announcing that addressing ransomware would be the first of DHS's 60-day sprints on pressing cybersecurity challenges, responding to ransomware is a priority for his administration. And it is definitely a priority for this committee and many in Congress. So I hope that this hearing will help further the conversation on how the private sector, Congress, the executive branch, and state, local governments can collaborate to address this crisis head on. In particular, I'm interested to learn how other committee priorities, including developing a cyber incident reporting framework, could improve our understanding of ransomware trends and how to defend against such attacks. Relatedly, I'm interested to hear how CISA can play an important role in information sharing and coordinating this response. As the agency that works closely with governments at all levels and the private sector on cybersecurity matters, I know it will have a significant role on this issue going forward. With that, I'd like to again thank the witnesses for being here, and the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Garbarino from New York, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you very much. And thank you to the witnesses for being here today. It's a very important issue. The global cost of ransomware has risen to $20 billion a year. Over the past several years, ransomware attacks have increased at an alarming rate. Attacks like NotPetya and WannaCry have had devastating impacts to critical sectors across the globe. Just a few months ago, both the Bayshore and Lindenhurst school districts on Long Island, in my district, were hit with cyber attacks. I am determined to work with hospitals, schools, and small businesses in New York's 2nd District and across the country to improve their cybersecurity posture in the wake of increasing threats. I believe it is now more important than ever to work with agencies like CISA, the Secret Service, and the Treasury Department to combat malicious cyber actors from targeting our struggling small businesses, healthcare institutions, and state and local governments. We must think of new, innovative ways to interrupt cyber criminals' ability to see this as financially viable way of doing business. It should come as a surprise to no one in this hearing that these ransomware attacks have devastating real-world consequences for Americans. Every minute that a hospital goes down is a minute of missed critical care. The same goes for almost every industry. We must work to put a stop to this. We need to double down on ensuring state and local entities and small businesses are prepared and adopt basic cybersecurity best practices to mitigate cyber risks. These practices can include two-factor authentication, strong passwords, retaining backups, developing a response plan, and updating software. CISA, in partnership with the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, also covers several no-cost services across the nation that should be leveraged by state and locals and the private sector. This includes the Joint Ransomware Guide developed both by CISA and the MSISAC that includes industry best practices and serves as consolidated resources for SLTT and the private sector. I'm a proud original co-sponsor of the Chairwoman's State and Local Cybersecurity Improvement Act. While we all can agree more resources for our state and local governments are necessary, we must also ensure these funds are spent responsibly and effectuate meaningful impacts on risk reduction. This important bill is a tremendous step forward in our fight, but we cannot stop there. While somewhere near only 2% of all cryptocurrency payments are nefarious, we know that most, if not all, ransomware payments utilize the anonymity of cryptocurrencies. We must adopt all of the above approach to dealing with this scourge. There is no single silver bullet. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the innovative solutions Congress should consider as we work to degrade and ultimately eliminate the viability of ransomware. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for bringing this important issue before us today. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Members are also reminded that the committees will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in their February 3rd colloquy regarding remote procedures. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New York, another gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman, from the great state of New York. I appreciate it. And Ranking Member Garbarino, thank you for holding this important hearing. And Mr. Krebs, it's always good to see you. It's been 24 hours since we were in a meeting together, so nice to see you again. In 2020, we witnessed one of the worst years on record for ransomware attacks, and it could not have come at a more tenuous time for our society. With the onset of the pandemic, the nation drastically shifted to remote work and services. While this yielded great benefits, it also provided a more expansive attack surface for cyber criminals. As COVID-19 cases increased, so did the number of devastating ransomware attacks. This trend represents an acceleration of what has impacted communities all across America for the past several years. In my district, for example, the Syracuse City School District and Onondaga County Library System previously fell victim to ransomware attacks that shut down their systems and halted the critical services that they provide. I cannot emphasize this strongly enough. State and local government and small businesses should leverage the free services that CISA offers to help prevent and mitigate the scourge of ransomware attacks. CISA's guidance and services can help SLTT and small businesses may take meaningful steps to increase the cybersecurity posture of their networks. These left of attack preventative actions can make the difference between a devastating cyber event and business as usual. We also must ensure CISA has the resources and capabilities to go toe-to-toe with sophisticated cyber criminals. CISA has made great strides to keep pace with the evolving threat, but there's much more that needs to be done. The fiscal year 2021 National Defense Authorization Act provided important authorities that I advocated for that will ultimately allow CISA to rise to the challenge. But these must be met with resources to implement them. As I've continued to say, Congress needs to put CISA on a path to being a $5 billion agency. I've been pleased to see CISA leveraging some of its newly established authorities, including state cybersecurity coordinators. These coordinators will be CISA's main point of contact embedded in each state government and be critically important to ensuring it has a strong understanding of the needs of our local governments. Additionally, I'm happy to see CISA is fully leveraging its new authority provided by the DOT Gov Act to administer the top level domain to provide secure and trustworthy .gov domains to state and local governments at no cost. CISA should also be doubling down on its efforts to stand up the Joint Cyber Planning Office to widen and streamline channels of communication between the federal government and industry. We must think outside the box when it comes to slowing the rapid expansion of ransomware. Equipping state and local governments with the resources to bolster their defenses is an important first step. And I'm looking forward to working with Subcommittee Chairwoman Clark and Chairman Thompson on the State and Local Cybersecurity Improvement Act to achieve that goal, but we can't stop there. I look forward to hearing testimony from our witnesses on innovative approaches that Congress should consider as we strive to tackle this problem once and for all. Recommendations from the Ransomware Task Force are a great place to start, but let's keep the pedal to the metal because we have a long way to go. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
I thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for your statement, and I now welcome our panel witnesses. Retired Major General John Davis is the Vice President for the Public Sector at Palo Alto Networks and is also a co-chair of the Ransomware Task Force at the Institute for Security and Technology. Prior to joining the Palo Alto Networks, General Davis served as the Senior Military Advisor for Cyber to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and served as the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. Ms. Megan Stiefel is the Executive Director for the Americas at the Global Cyber Alliance and is also a co-chair of the Ransomware Task Force. Prior, Ms. Stiefel, served as a director for international cyber policy in the National Security Council at the White House and was an attorney in the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. Mr. Dennis Goulet is the Commissioner of the Department of Information Technology for the state of New Hampshire and the current president of the National Association of State Chief Information Officers. Mr. Goulet also has nearly 30 years of private sector IT experience in the sectors ranging from healthcare to manufacturing. And finally, Mr. Chris Krebs, former director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, at the Department of Homeland Security. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with General Davis.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to appear before you today to discuss actionable policy solutions to address the unsustainable rise of ransomware. And I would like to thank Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Katko, Chairwoman Clark, and Ranking Member Garbarino for their leadership on this important issue. And I offer my commitment to work in partnership with you and your staff to support the committee's actions to address this threat. That the committee would hold this hearing shows that you see what we do, that ransomware is a profound and growing threat. Indeed, we believe that it's crossed a threshold. It's no longer purely a criminal nuisance driven by profit motive. And now it's impacting national security, economic stability, and public health and safety of the national and international community on a massive scale. And unfortunately, the problem is getting worse. An analysis by the Palo Alto Network's Unit 42 Threat Intelligence Team concluded that the average ransom paid for organizations increased 171% year over year from 2019 to 2020. And adversary tactics are increasingly egregious. As mentioned earlier, in 2020, for instance, ransomware disproportionately impacted the healthcare sector as hospital systems struggled to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. This unsustainable trajectory compelled the creation of the Ransomware Task Force. And our goal was not to achieve an unrealistic outcome where all ransomware can be eliminated. Rather, our objective is to proactively and relentlessly disrupt the ransomware business model and make ransomware a threat that can be more effectively managed through a series of coordinated actions which can be implemented by industry, government, and civil society. In total, the report identifies 48 actions across 4 strategic goals: to deter ransomware attacks through a nationally and internationally coordinated comprehensive strategy, to disrupt the ransomware business model and decrease criminal profits, to help organizations prepare for ransomware attacks, and to respond to ransomware attacks more effectively. Our recommendations should be viewed as a set of collective, mutually reinforcing actions that should be applied with continuous, coordinated, and overwhelming pressure. Some can be immediately pursued. Some will require more time and creative policy solutions, including new legislation. I'll focus today on 2 of the report's recommendations. First, the United States should lead by example and execute a sustained, aggressive, whole-of-government anti-ransomware campaign coordinated by the White House and in partnership with the private sector. A foundational step is recognizing that the nature of the ransomware challenge will require a massive team effort across government, industry, academia, nonprofits, and the international community. This effort and our recommendations must be embraced at the highest levels of government and industry as a policy priority and given sufficient resources. To this end, we're heartened to see recent actions at the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice that signal elevated prioritization. Second, we should develop a clear, actionable framework for ransomware mitigation, response, and recovery. We see a core responsibility to help all organizations better prepare. Improving the ability to prepare for and even prevent ransomware events from happening in the first place is, in my view, the single most important function in reducing this threat to a manageable level. The adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, is especially true in the case of ransomware, because once you've been hit, you've already lost the battle and can only play a painful catch-up game. Most organizations, regardless of size or security acumen, are aware of the threat, yet these organizations don't understand how to reduce their risk. An action we can take is the creation of an internationally accepted framework that establishes clear steps to prevent or recover from attacks. Finally, these recommendations serve as a foundation for other policy actions. For example, the task force recommends the creation of a cybersecurity grant program for states where funding for ransomware prevention technologies could be unlocked through alignment to the best practice framework once it's established. This will enhance the resilience of local information systems and provide a much needed modernization of security tools to prevent attacks. Distinguished members of this subcommittee, thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Stiefel to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Clark, Ranking Member Garbarino, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the growing threat ransomware poses to our homeland and national security. My name is Megan Stiefel, and I'm the Executive Director Americas at the Global Cyber Alliance, an international nonprofit organization dedicated to providing practical solutions to reducing cybersecurity risk. Like John, I appear before you today as co-chair of the Ransomware Task Force, a group of more than 50 organizations that convene with the Institute of Security and Technology and gathered over the past 4 months to develop a comprehensive framework to reduce the risk of ransomware. Last week, the task force published a report outlining 5 priority recommendations to achieve 4 goals, as noted, with a series of 48 total recommendations. I'll focus my testimony today on 3 of these recommendations. First, the need for a coordinated international diplomatic and law enforcement effort to prioritize ransomware, supported in the United States by a whole of government strategy. Second, the need for enhanced information to support and enable this effort, including the development of a ransomware framework to help organizations better prepare for and respond to ransomware. And third, the establishment of cyber response and recovery funds and other assistance to support ransomware response and other cybersecurity activities. As the members of the subcommittee well know, the scope and scale of ransomware has grown exponentially over the past year. Payments in the $40,000 range in 2019 quadrupled to $170,000 on average in 2020. Recent reports indicate that some payments have stretched to the millions, while demands have stretched to the tens of millions. But as also noted, not the size of payments just grew, but also the number of organizations targeted. 2,400 US-based government healthcare facilities and schools were known to have been targeted in 2020 by ransomware. The actual number of affected potentially may be much higher. In addition to holding access to data hostage, ransomware actors now threaten to publish the data they obtain from victims' networks. According to one report, in the 4th quarter of 2020, 70% of reported ransomware attacks threatened to release the data. Ransomware is, plain and simple, 21st century extortion. These figures illustrate that in just a few years, ransomware has grown from a nuisance to a national security threat. Organizations around the world have been targeted, but as has also been well established, ransomware actors operate from safe havens, countries whose governments are mostly unwilling as well as unable to assist in efforts to bring them to justice. As such, without significantly limiting the ransomware attack at scale, there is little guarantee it will not simply emerge elsewhere, presenting an ongoing risk to the global community. The Ransomware Task Force convened in order to address this growing international challenge. Its breadth influenced the task force's first priority recommendation. Specifically, the coordinated international diplomatic and enforcement efforts make clear that ransomware is an international national security and law enforcement priority, and that an international coalition be established to combat it. Governments must also develop comprehensive resource strategies that use both carrots and sticks to reduce the number of countries providing safe havens. But as the task force's other recommendations make clear, governments must also work collaboratively together and with the private sector to share information, jointly investigate, and bring these actors to justice, or otherwise eliminate their ability to operate with impunity. For the United States, the task force recommends that this effort be led by a whole of government strategy out of the White House. This strategy should also include a ransomware task force to coordinate a nationwide campaign against ransomware and identify and pursue opportunities for international collaboration. This task force should also collaborate closely with private sector organizations that can help defend and disrupt ransomware operations, such as security vendors, platforms, ISOs, and cybersecurity nonprofits. Second, better information is necessary to enable this collective international action. It is important to emphasize we're not talking about more information sharing of indicators of compromise. Both the scope and quality of information must improve. For example, IOC should be tied to ransomware incidents, and this information must get quickly into the hands of those who can use it, within the government as well as outside it. IOCs must also be supplemented with additional information, including payments. Better information, however, is necessary but insufficient to fully combat this threat. Organizations, both their leadership as well as their operational roles, need to understand that ransomware is a real and relevant threat, and they need better guidance on how to prioritize mitigation efforts, especially given their limited resources. To address this gap, the task force recommends that a framework be developed to help organizations better prepare for and respond to ransomware attacks, together with materials to support framework implementation, such as toolkits and other how-to resources. The Global Cyber Alliance and other organizations, I'm sure, is ready to add such guidance to our existing resources to assist organizations in reducing their risk. Finally, additional resources for implementation are essential to the success of the ransomware framework and through with the disruption of the ransomware business model. The task force therefore recommends that governments establish response and recovery funds. The task force believes that the availability of these funds will help reduce the number of victims electing to pay the ransom demand. As an incentive, organizations could be required, in order to access such funds, demonstrated use of the ransomware framework to ensure a commitment to a baseline level of cybersecurity. In addition, the task force recommends that more grant funding be available. For example, Homeland Security preparedness grants could be expanded to address cybersecurity threats. On a personal note, I'd like to emphasize the importance of these grants. A dollar spent to prevent crime will be more effective than a dollar spent to recover from it. In closing, I want to highlight the essential role nonprofits played in developing the task force's recommendations and that they can play in their implementation. Nonprofits develop policy recommendations, support information sharing, and in the case of GCA, provide guidance on the implementation of established cybersecurity best practices, including to combat ransomware. Task force offered a range of actions that could be taken building upon these capabilities to stem the burgeoning ransomware threat. Nonprofits depend on contributions from a range of stakeholders to fulfill their unique and important roles. Now more than ever, it is critically important that all stakeholders take collective action to combat this threat. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I welcome your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Goulet to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Clark, Garbarino, distinguished members of the subcommittee for inviting me today to speak on the cybersecurity challenges facing.
Can everyone hear?
Department of Information Technology in New Hampshire.
Mr. Goulet, can you either get closer to the microphone? We're having a hard time hearing you.
Better?
Yeah, if you could just speak up, that'd be great.
Thank you, Chairwoman Clark, Ranking Member Garbarino, distinguished members of the subcommittee for inviting me today to speak on the cybersecurity challenges facing state and local governments. As Commissioner for the Department of Information Technology in New Hampshire, President of NASIO, I am grateful for the opportunity to discuss cybersecurity, efforts to mitigate ransomware attacks, as well as highlight the vital role that state information technology agencies play in providing critical citizen services, ensuring continuity of government. Cybersecurity has remained the top priority for state CIOs for the past 8 years. In my state and across the country, we are observing a shift among government leaders treating cybersecurity as a continuity of government issue. While we used to be concerned with theft of data and personally identifiable information, the different scope of cyber attacks today are aimed at crippling the functioning. Recent attacks on water treatment facilities and hospital systems have shown us how these incidents have progressed from digital consequences to sophisticated strikes designed to threaten the health and safety of our nation's citizens. We have observed that ransomware incidents are disproportionately affecting the LTT part in state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. The question of why the federal government should be contributing to the cybersecurity of the states is states are the primary agency for delivering a vast array of federal programs and services. Lack of adequate resources for cybersecurity continues to be the most significant challenge facing state and local governments. State CIOs are tasked with additional responsibilities, including providing cybersecurity assistance to local governments, doing so with shortages in both funding and cyber talent. 2020 NASIO cybersecurity study found that only 36% of states and territories have a dedicated cybersecurity budget. Nearly a third have seen no growth in those budgets. Almost all CIOs are directly responsible for the cybersecurity in their state and have initiatives to improve their cybersecurity posture. These programs are crucial as Congress considers the implementation of a cybersecurity program for state and local governments. Key elements include a centralized approach to cybersecurity, adoption of a cybersecurity strategic plan and framework, development of a cyber disruption response plan, and implementation of regular security awareness training for employees and contractors. For the past decade, Mascio has advocated for whole of state cybersecurity. We define this approach as collaboration among state and agencies, local governments, National Guard, the education sector, critical infrastructure providers, and private sector partners. By approaching cybersecurity as a team sport, information is widely shared and each stakeholder has a clearly defined role to play. My colleagues across the country have significantly increased our involvement in fighting ransomware, especially with our local government partners. We have taken on additional responsibilities and incurred new expenses while continuing to face an unrelenting cyber threat environment. I am truly concerned about how crucial IT and cybersecurity initiatives are funded coming months and years. While COVID relief legislation has provided opportunities for some states to improve their cybersecurity posture, the pandemic has amplified vulnerabilities in state and local networks. I know I speak for all of my colleagues around the country when I say that a dedicated, federally funded cybersecurity grant program like the State and Local Cybersecurity Improvement Act is overdue and will strengthen our ability to defend ourselves from cyber attacks. Since the act would also require state legislatures to match a portion of federal grant funds, it would provide an increased incentive for state legislatures to make cyber an ongoing priority in every state's budget. I look forward to continuing to work with the members of this subcommittee on the creation of a program to improve our cybersecurity. This concludes my formal testimony. I look forward. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Krebs to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Clark, Congresswoman Rice, Ranking Member Gavarino, members of the subcommittee, it's my pleasure to appear before you today to discuss much needed efforts to combat ransomware. Given my recent experience as CISA director, I remain on a bit of a personal and professional crusade to raise attention and drive towards disruptive solutions to this growing national security threat. I'd like to start with why we're here. In 2011, famed Silicon Valley innovator and entrepreneur Marc Andreessen famously penned in a Wall Street Journal piece that software is eating the world. A decade later, if left unchecked, ransomware will similarly eat the world. This is not a problem that is going to go away or solve itself. The last several years alone showed that cyber criminals are not only getting better, they are diversifying and they are specializing and they are getting more brazen. To put it simply, we are on the cusp of a global digital pandemic driven by greed, a vulnerable digital ecosystem, and an ever-widening criminal enterprise. The underlying enabling factors for this cybercrime explosion are rooted in the digital dumpster fire of our seemingly pathological need to connect everything to the internet, combined with how hard it is to actually secure what we have connected. Two more recent factors have thrown fuel on the already smoldering heap. The spread of cryptocurrencies that enable the transfer of funds largely outside the eyes of financial regulators, and corrupt safe havens that don't mind if a little crime happens on their turf as long as it brings home some revenue, directs malicious online activities elsewhere, and has the added benefit of making life more difficult for strategic adversaries. It is important to reinforce that cryptocurrency in and of itself is not a criminal enterprise, nor do I currently believe eradicating or regulating it to the point of uselessness is the answer. The challenge is to appropriately intervene to avoid societal harms while fostering a marketplace for technologies like cryptocurrency where we can both lead in innovation and maintain a globally competitive edge. We have seen some glimpses of an appetite to address the ransomware crisis with the recent announcement of the Department of Justice ransomware-focused initiative and the Department of Homeland Security's ransomware 60-day sprint. These efforts build on prior efforts from the Secret Service, FBI, CISA, and other organizations. Critically, there are also indications that the White House is considering a more strategic approach on the ransomware front soon. But last week was perhaps the most promising development with the Ransomware Task Force releasing its report. The task force identified where the real policy and operational gaps lie. First, the need for prioritization across the national security structure. Second, greater ransomware-focused operational public-private collaboration. Third, choke points in the cryptocurrency payments kill chain. And fourth, in addressing the challenges facing the cybersecurity insurance industry. Perhaps the area with greatest need for government investment, however, is not necessarily within the federal government, but as Mr. Goulet pointed out, within our state and local partners. The idea is simple. We can reduce attack surface across state, local, tribal, and territorial government organizations in this country by investing in more modern systems. In doing so, we can improve citizen services for all Americans, create more tech jobs in our communities, and continue to invest in today's and tomorrow's technology innovators. It's a way to defend against today's threats while investing in secure tomorrow. Ultimately, whatever the administration and Congress choose to do, there is no single solution or silver bullet. No one organization alone will solve this problem. Much like confronting election security threats or disinformation more broadly, there are a range of levers that government and industry can pull to achieve positive outcomes. I'd like to thank the committee for holding this timely hearing. I would also like to thank you for your leadership and constant, enduring support of CISA. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Krebs. Our chairwoman is going to be back in a few minutes. So I think what I'm going to do is ask Congressman Garbarino to begin his 5 minutes of questioning.
Okay, thank you very much, Congresswoman Rice. Mr. Krebs, thank you very much. I love that we both used the silver bullet analogy. That was very good. We have similar speechwriters, I guess. And you touched about this a little in your opening, but as you know, over the past few years, there's been a robust discussion about the need for state and local cybersecurity grant program. While no one here will disagree that an increase in funding is vitally needed, we also need to ensure that these funds are spent responsibly and in a way that meaningfully buys down risk. I know you have to have the buy-in from the state and locals, but can you talk about specifically the role CISA needs to play in providing the state and local governments with the cybersecurity guidance and expertise?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. I do think we share some staff, perhaps some of my former staff, at least. So I think we should step back a little bit and think about where we are from a legislative perspective right now. And there's a lot of conversation in both chambers of the Congress about infrastructure and infrastructure investments. And I think that this is a great opportunity to rethink, at least strategically, about what an infrastructure investment package looks like. Everything we do today in our communities, in our society, in our economy has some sort of connectivity to it. It has some sort of attack surface from a cybersecurity perspective. And so all infrastructure investments should include a consideration for modernizing the underlying IT systems as well as security aspects of that. And so my concept is let's do a 21st century digital infrastructure investment act that will allow state CIOs and community CIOs like Mr. Goulet not just buy cybersecurity technologies, but get off some of the dated legacy systems that they have that are, tend to have higher recurring operations and maintenance costs that in some cases cannot be updated and are no longer supported. And that was kind of my point about it'll increase citizen services. It'll be more resilient to attack. It'll increase tech jobs in our communities. And ultimately, it'll plow money back into U.S. tech companies, which will keep us at the cutting edge of the technology sectors. Now, CISA can play a role in advising state and locals, in helping administer a grant program, either within CISA to help dole out those grant funds, or work with an existing state grant program like over at FEMA and provide that technical expertise. We've done that in the past. CISA has done that in the past with some of the state Homeland Security grant program fundings. So there's the expertise there, the mechanisms are there. I think the infrastructure, so to speak, for a grant program is in place at CISA as well as at FEMA. And so now it's just a matter of authorizing the program and then providing sufficient funds.
I thank you very much for that answer. Mr. Goulet, would you agree with what Mr. Krebs was saying, or would you like to expand on any other roles that you think CISA could provide to state and local governments?
Yeah, so first of all, I wholeheartedly agree on the legacy system comments. We, state of New Hampshire recently conducted a independent comprehensive cyber risk assessment, and the findings came back overwhelmingly pointing at legacy systems where we found vulnerabilities. In fact, we ended up shutting down some of our citizen-facing systems temporarily while we mitigated those, and so that actually motivated the agency in question to look harder and prioritize more effort at addressing that. We are so happy with the partnership with CISA. We've seen, we love the collaboration, and we intend to continue that and leverage it further and provide our input as well in terms of how we can work better together. So very much in support of that.
Great, I appreciate that. I have some other questions, but I'll do a quick one because I only have 30 seconds. And it's for everybody, and I think it's just a yes or no, if you can be rapid. And some of you touched on it. Should ransomware payments be made illegal? The members of the IST task force were conflicted on this. Jump in whenever you want.
Wow.
This is a tough one. I'm gonna hedge on this. I'd say at a minimum, I think we should payments should be made at a very last possible resort, and if payments are made, they should in some way be either licensed or logged and reported to the government. We frankly just don't have the denominator on all the victims, and it's hard to really control the risk from there.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady from New York for stepping in momentarily on my behalf. We're all juggling hearings during this time, so I truly appreciate it. I will now recognize myself for questions. Mr. Goulet, currently cybersecurity is a permissible use of funds awarded under the State Homeland Security Grant Program and the Urban Area Security Initiative. I was pleased to see that Secretary Mayorkas announced earlier this year that recipients would need to dedicate at least 7.5% of their award towards cybersecurity. However, in your testimony, you emphasized that there is a need for a separate, dedicated cybersecurity grant program. Can you elaborate on why existing grant programs are inadequate for ensuring state and local governments develop the kind of comprehensive cybersecurity improvements necessary for combating ransomware? Mr. Goulet, I think you have to unmute.
The existing, we apply for grants each time in New Hampshire. In fact, we've used that grant money to develop our cyber disruption plan in the state of New Hampshire. That is a strong plan. But around the states, myself and my colleagues and the CISOs in the states receive very small percentage of the total grant funding that goes through that program, and the amounts that we are able to access are not adequate to the task.
Understood. Ms. Stiefel, one of the recommendations of the Ransomware Task Force is the creation of response and recovery funds. We have seen similar proposals from the Solarium Commission and in the President's budget request. What kind of entities do you believe should be eligible for assistance under these funds, and under what circumstances, and what kinds of expenses would be covered?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for the question. Yes, we, as you noted, agree that these types of funds need to be established. As far as the types of entities that could be recipients or eligible for these funds, in the first instance, I would say those that we've identified previously in this conversation today: state, local, tribal, territorial, as well as potentially organizations that are providing critical national functions. Therefore, as NRMC is currently working to identify or has identified these essential function entities, they would also be, in our mind, an eligible recipient. As far as the types of resources that could be, these funds could be put to, we've identified, I think I agree with other panelists who said that the legacy systems are a first priority. And this is particularly the case in light of what we've been through over the past 18 months, or excuse me, 14 months with the pandemic, the decrease in taxes that are funneling to states, and therefore even more constrained resources to put towards cybersecurity. So we urge that the committee, and appreciative of the committee in putting forward or renewing your legislation from last session. Thank you.
Thank you. General Davis, when we talk about ransomware, we hear about how it is a growing crisis, and we see statistics showing an increasing number of attacks with larger financial impacts and more disruption. What existing efforts have you seen that are currently working to defend against or mitigate the impacts of ransomware? And are there examples of actions that organizations are taking that are reducing risk that can serve as a model for others?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Yes, I have a couple of thoughts about that, and the fact that that doing a lot on the front end and even a little bit goes a long way, as we state in the report. So first of all, I'll just say basics matter, and in many cases, increasing security in a few key areas could make a significant difference in an effort to prepare for attacks. Complex security software or complete network rebuilds may not be required. And implementing things that we heard up front by one of the congressmen was implementing multi-factor authentication or adopting password managers. Those kinds of things can dramatically improve an organization's security posture. And although any organization, regardless of its security, could be a target for ransomware, improving baseline security and raising awareness among employees can go very far in protecting organizations from attack. And there are some very basic human behavior related actions that can help with the problem of phishing, which remains one of the most often used initial access methods for ransomware. So, I mean, just being suspicious of who's knocking on your digital front door and not answering it when you weren't expecting the visitor, so to speak, is a good way to look at some very basic things that can be done. In addition, technology, although not the single answer, can provide some both emerging capabilities as well as legacy capabilities that can help improve this fight. So there's a whole array of things that I believe can be used up front in order to help prevent a lot of what we're seeing from the ransomware threat in the first place.
Thank you very much for your response, Mr. General Davis. I now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank all the ones that are testifying. Thank you for your time. Mr. Krebs, I was on a bank board for a number of years, and they had a cyber attack, and it was like pulling teeth to get them to, I guess, let the word out and to get help from others. They finally corrected it. But two questions. How can we get, and I understand the reason, because their stock price, the name, you know, their, I guess, relationship with customers that may be threatened, may have been threatened if it had gotten out. But how do we, in your opinion, what will we do to have them at least get the word out and get help from a lot of different factors? This is a $20 billion problem. And secondly, when an attack actually occurs, you know, if we have an emergency, we call 911. If you need the police, 999. You know, if you need an ambulance, you know, we know the number to call. But what should a company do? One, to get the word out and get help, and two, you know, what do they do when they are attacked? Because they're kind of left holding the bag and not really knowing who to go to or what expert that could solve the problem. Can you shed some light on that?
Yes, sir. So I think on your first question of how do we get more organizations leaning forward and being more transparent about their events, I think things have perhaps gotten a little bit better in the last couple of years, in part because some of the requirements for publicly traded companies to file reports, public reports. We're also seeing, I think, a new breed or strain of corporate executives that perhaps have been through enough events and they recognize that being forthcoming, being transparent, and being straight up with your customers, your clients, actually benefits you in the long run. And really, the idea here is that do you want to be straight up with your customers, or do you want to hide something from them and then they go away because they don't trust you? That trust is the coin of the realm, and you've really got to protect that. So I think in part we need to explore for at least critical. Those most critical infrastructures, as Megan Stiefel mentioned, that there are some degree of or some sort of requirements for them to make notifications at a minimum to the federal government and to law enforcement. But more broadly, we have to continue reinforce with our friends in the executive community, boards of directors, that it's ultimately in their best interest to be a good corporate citizen and come forward. On your second piece, how do we get more prepared? Well, that's actually probably the most important part right now. And goes to what General Davis said about that ounce of prevention, pound of cure. There's, at least in FEMA natural disaster calculations, that $1 invested up front in mitigation saves you $4 in incident response. The same thing applies here. The costs of responding to, even if you pay the ransom, the costs of responding to a ransomware event are massive. And it's not a guarantee you get everything back. So it's all about preparation, planning, and if you do have a bad day, because everybody has a bad day sometime, but do you know what to do? Do you know how to respond? Do you have a team on contract? Do you have relationships with CISA, with the FBI, with the intelligence community, where you can get on top of this thing quickly as soon as you detect it and shut it down? So it's all about preparation and playbook planning.
Okay, and quickly, I guess this will be for anybody. I don't want to go over my time, but regulations. OMB had a GAO had a report that 49 to 76% of regulations are redundant when it comes to cybersecurity. What's your opinion of that? And then getting, if it is a problem, getting it cured, do you go to OMB? Who do you go to? Mr. Krebs, we'll start off with you.
Yes, sir. So I think we need to look at different levers we can pull here. The federal government has procurement powers, one of the largest procurers of, for instance, IT technologies. I think what we're probably going to see out of the White House with an executive order is increased enhanced security requirements for software. That's going to have a trickle-down effect throughout the rest of the economy. But I still think that there are specific parts of the economy, those highest risk critical infrastructures, that have enjoyed an enormous amount of success in the economy, and they have to step up from a corporate citizenship perspective and apply enhanced security requirements, and that's an area to explore for regulation.
Well, I'm out of time. I don't want to take other time, but help us do that, because y'all are in a position to let us know. Thank you, Chairman Clark. I yield back.
Of Texas.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This is Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. I just want to make sure you all can hear me. And thank you to the ranking member for holding this hearing that is crucial, and one that we've been immersed in for those of us who've served on this committee for quite a long time. To each of the witnesses, very grateful for your presentations dealing with how we deal with ransomware. And I remember being chair of the Transportation Security and Infrastructure Committee, which now is the Cybersecurity Committee, and we were talking about the amount of cyber in the private sector, which at that time was 85% versus 15% in the government. But what we really have come to find out is that we all are interrelated. So let me focus my questioning, and as I do so, let me acknowledge former Director Krebs of CISA. We are grateful certainly for your service. We regret the fact that your work as head of CISA ended over your principled stand that the election was in fact a legitimate election, and that you had seen and determined that there was no cyber fraud or any kind of fraud under your jurisdiction that would have countered the election of Joe Biden. Principle in government, I think, is crucial, and I want to particularly thank you for that. My work in the 117th Congress has included introducing H.R. 119, the Cyber Defense National Guard Act, H.R. 118, the Cyber Vulnerability Disclosure Reporting Act, and as well H.R. 57, the DHS Cybersecurity Asset Protection of Infrastructure under Terrorist Act, Logistical Structure Act, which is called the Capitals Act. And I hope in this Congress we'll be able to pass these legislative initiatives in particular because they really deal with the vulnerabilities of the system at this time. I'd like to pose to you, Director Krebs, because of your current past experience, if you will, dealing with this agency. And what I recall is that you were very interested in standing this agency up and making it stronger. I'd be interested in your understanding of the strength of the ransomware task force and some of the provisions that it offered. But in the course of you saying that, I'd like to know what Congress could do to strengthen this agency. I believe it should be given a greater jurisdiction and support with resources. And what ultimate role, how large a role do you believe the agency should play in combating ransomware? We always say that the large amount, as I said earlier, of this cyber infrastructure is in the private sector. I believe, however, the government can be very effective in helping to steer that sector along with their cooperation. Director Krebs?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that. And thank you for the kind words. It certainly was an honor of a career and of a lifetime to serve as director of CISA. But I will say that I am incredibly excited for the agency and the nominee for the next director, Jen Easterly. I've known her for quite some time, and she is an absolute rock star, and she's going to do great things there. Which brings me to your question about what more can we do here? What more can we do next? I think the last several years, particularly the National Defense Authorization Act of 21, was very beneficial to CISA. In fact, I just read a letter or article this morning that the agency has used its administrative subpoena authorities recently, and that was something that I had asked for last Congress, and it would allow CISA to make notifications on vulnerable systems to IT providers, and that's the sort of thing that can help. I think ultimately the area that CISA needs the most support from Congress in that we've seen previous support, but we need to expand from here. What I would always say is the future of CISA is in the field. So we have now statewide coordinators, or one in or on the way to at least every state capital to work with the state CIOs, to work with the election officials. That is an area that we need to consider continuing to boost. So we need not just 47 of them, we may need 150 of them, because there is plenty of work out there for everyone to do. I also think we need to think about, as we resource a grant program, what additional shared services can CISA provide? We see CISA providing shared services for the federal government through programs like continuous diagnostics and mitigation, the recently awarded protective DNS service, and also the hardened cloud environment that CISA is going to provide for the federal government. Can CISA build a gold image almost cloud service that states can use, get some economies of scale, get centrally monitored and logged? Those are the sorts of game-changing technologies that I think can really help manage security better.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I now, the chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Harshbarger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Clark and Ranking Member Garbino and all the witnesses. This is something really alarms me. You know, when you see that there's, when I read this report, 2,400 U.S.-based government healthcare facilities and schools that were victims, that's unbelievable. And, you know, when I was on another committee here, seeing that our own government, our federal agencies can be hacked due to apps and uploading or updating apps, that's a scare. That's a scary proposition to know that. I guess it's just a statement, and then I can go to each one of the members. As everybody knows, the cyber incident reporting has been a significant point of interest following significant cyber incidences. The committee is interested in better understanding that the right combination of mandatory incident reporting with appropriate incentives. And I guess, Mr. Krebs, I can start with you and open it up to the whole panel. Should our intelligence and law enforcement agencies be given carte blanche to take down the networks of people and organizations perpetuating ransomware?
I think there's always a set of trade-offs when you talk about the intelligence community and their activities. I think they've historically focused on the exquisite threats, the intelligence capabilities. But I think what we're seeing, as evidenced by recent Department of Treasury sanctions, is that ransomware gangs and foreign intelligence services are working hand in glove. They're in fact taking direction. Evil Corp was a Russian crew that was taking direction from the FSB. Those are the linkages that we really need to explore. And that, to me, I think is what really kind of tipped ransomware over into the clear national security threat. And once you have those linkages, I do think that opens up additional authorities for consideration by the Title 10 and Title 50 organizations.
Mr. Davis?
Congresswoman, I agree with Chris Krebs on this. And I'll just tell you from the perspective of my experience in government, including now in the private sector, it's a blurry world out there in this murky cyber-related business between state and non-state actors. And I believe that states now see an opportunity to leverage non-state entities in a variety of ways to fundamentally undermine and gain an advantage over Western democracies in general, not just the United States. This is in the area that you've seen in terms of misinformation and disinformation, but it's also in ways to circumvent sanctions and to get around them through the specific capabilities associated with ransomware. We've seen various states now that have begun to embrace this idea of leveraging these other entities, these criminal entities and others, in order to undermine democracy. And I think that what we're seeing is this is just another reason why the task force has taken the position that you all seem to agree with. This is now a national security related threat.
Absolutely. Mr. Goulet?
Well, this real time as our networks are being hammered by these actors, both the nations and nation states as well as other actors. So the volume of that, it continues to increase, and our relative investment on the things that we need to do there to protect ourselves needs to increase. So we're absolutely right in the middle of that swirling mass of things, and I think it's been traditional because the state governments carry a lot of information that could be useful for our enemies, and also I think that it's there's so much important stuff happening at the government level, whether it's a state or local. Like for a great example would be a computer-aided dispatch system being shut down by a law enforcement agency, where that's, or dispatching for ambulance, that kind of thing, which we've seen happen. It really is a big deal. And you did mention incident reporting, which I wanted to touch on. I have legislation pending in New Hampshire that would mandate incident reporting for the political subdivisions to the state so that we can collaborate better. And I've had a couple occasions where I found out about an incident in a school or or a police department from the press versus from hearing about it. And it's not a great way to collaborate. So I think, going on that theme that, it's not shameful to have a cyber incident happen to you. In fact, it's probably happened to almost every agency, and we all need to, be transparent, report, and respond better.
Absolutely. Well, I think my time's up. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes one of our preeminent experts in this space, all things cyber, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, for 5 minutes.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you for organizing this this important hearing today. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony, and it's a great contribution to our efforts to try to better protect the country in cyberspace and get our arms around this vexing problem. So I want to begin, of course, by congratulating General Davis and Ms. Stiefel and all the co-chairs of the Ransomware Task Force for the report. I believe it's an important document and a fine example of industry self-organizing to put forth important policy recommendations. This is an issue. Cyber is something the government can't solve on its own, private sector can't solve on its own, and it really needs to have that public-private partnership. And it's great to see you acting as a resource. So let me begin, and I also, of course, want to thank former Director Krebs for being here today, and I want to echo the comments of my colleague from Texas in thanking you for your extraordinary service at CISA and especially securing our elections. Mr. Krebs, in your testimony, you referenced the work of the Solarium Commission as a model for making these recommendations a reality. One of the recommendations we got done last year, in no small thanks, no small part, I should say, thanks to your help in so many ways, is creating a joint cyber planning office at CISA. What role do you see for the JICPO and in ransomware task force's recommendations?
So thank you for that, and good to see you again. As we heard from the ranking member, twice in 24 hours is a pretty good streak here. What needs to be done within the federal government right now, and this is frankly one of my greatest frustrations over the last 4 years, is we needed a strategic approach to countering ransomware, given the fact that there are a multitude of agencies that have an authority, a lever, or some sort of influence they have over the problem set. So let's begin with the White House, the National Security Council, stating that this is going to be a national security imperative to counter ransomware. So with that stage set, you can declare whatever the policy is and then turn it over to an operational piece. There are a couple operational pieces that already exist. You have the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force that the FBI hosts that runs campaigns. You have the National Cyber Forensic and Training Alliance in Pittsburgh that also does some information sharing. But I think, again, we need to bring together the broader set of authorities from law enforcement, civil defenses, defensive agencies, civilian agencies, the IC and the Department of Defense, and the JICPO could play a role there to coordinate operations.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer. I strongly support leveraging the JICPO to coordinate this kind of campaign planning in coordination with the National Cyber Director. And I've been briefed several times by the Executive Assistant Director Goldstein on the stand-up of the JICPO, and I certainly believe it will be well positioned to coordinate a whole of government effort. So let me turn next, Ms. Stiefel and General Davis. This subcommittee focuses a lot on CISA's federal network defense role, and we've closely monitored the federal response to SolarWinds. However, CISA has a much broader responsibility to coordinate protection of critical infrastructure that I'm concerned are significantly under-resourced. So the Cyberspace Solarium Commission has recommended increasing CISA's funding by $400 million next year to help increase operational capacity to address threats like ransomware. Do you support such an increase, and do you believe it falls in line with the task force report? General Davis, want to start with you, and then Ms. Stiefel?
Sure, Congressman. I don't know about the specifics of it from a task force perspective. I do know that that the task force report specifically speaks about the role of DHS in a number of different areas. I believe there are, if I have it right, 10 of the recommendations across each of the four main, deter, disrupt, prepare, and respond functions have what we recommend is a role either as a leading role or a supporting role for DHS. And so in order to do this, DHS and CISA specifically have really an oversized role, and they need the support, adequate support in terms of skills, capability, capacities, and authorities. And so I don't know what the right answer is, but I do believe that in order for DHS and CISA specifically to pick up the roles and responsibilities that we're recommending in these 10 various recommendations, it is going to require commensurate resources, and that will be above and beyond what they currently have today.
Thank you. I know my time's run out, but I don't know, Ms. Stiefel, do you have anything briefly?
I would just agree with John. Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I do agree that additional resources are necessary for CISA to step into and mature into the organization that it needs to be in order to better protect the homeland.
Agreed. Thank you all. Appreciate that, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde.
Thank you, Chairwoman Clark and Ranking Member Garbarino, for holding this very important hearing. In my district, though we are mostly a rural district, we had a very detrimental attack that occurred to a local manufacturing company called ASI. And that ransomware attack completely shut them down for almost 6 weeks. And though the ransom was only $100,000 in Bitcoin, it cost them over $1 million in hard cash to replace their systems in order to recover. So this is a very, very serious issue, not just for government entities, but for commercial entities as well. So my question goes to Mr. Krebs here. I was reading in the ransomware guide, which I thought was a pretty amazing document, that CISA offers a no-cost vulnerability scanning service and other no-cost assessments. So I followed the links in the guide to a document that further explained these no-cost cyber hygiene services, what they were, and they include vulnerability scanning, web application scanning, phishing campaign assessment, and remote penetration scanning, which I thought was very outstanding. And from what I have read, they are available to all agencies, federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial, as well as public and private sector critical infrastructure organizations. So just two things here quickly. How does CISA get this guide out and get the word out on these services, which I think are phenomenal? And can you explain how an entity would sign up for them? And then how would you also determine what a critical infrastructure entity is in the private sector? Thank you.
Yes, sir. So what you have highlighted here was one of my biggest concerns. There's a great deal of technical acumen and expertise at CISA, really good cyber expertise. Marketing, on the other hand, was not a real area of strength. And that goes back to my earlier point of the future of CISA is in the field. One of the greatest ways, the best ways to engage with our stakeholders, which are not all the time, at least in the Beltway, is to get out there and mingle in their community. As a Georgia native, I know your district quite well, spent a lot of time up there playing sports and all that good stuff. But we would need somebody that would be in that area, that would be meeting with the state and local representatives, that would be meeting with the critical infrastructure. And then just from a critical infrastructure perspective, we tend to know what the riskiest stuff is out there. But a lot of it's self-selection and again, it's marketing. It's customer centricity. It's getting out there with constant engagement and asking, what do you need?
Okay, great, thank you. The question about what determines whether an entity in the private sector is critical infrastructure or not. I mean, do you guys make that determination yourself, or is there something that you go on, a definition that you go on?
So critical infrastructure in the United States is anything from banks to bridges, schools to sewers. It is a broad categorization that would lead an organization into a partnership, a voluntary partnership with CISA. Okay. There are critical infrastructures that at greatest risk can be identified and tagged by CISA. There's no, regulatory requirement necessarily that goes along with that, but it tends to be a self-sorting mechanism that brings organizations in to work with us.
Okay, if any private sector organizations choose to work with you, I assume that CISA gives them complete confidence that any data that they share or anything that is held in complete confidence with CISA?
We have a pretty good track record, yes, sir, or at least as I was there and prior of not sharing or leaking or disclosing information about partners. And there are some regulatory protective measures, the Protected Critical Infrastructure Information Program that actually has criminal penalties on federal employees that disclose information.
Okay, that's great to know. Thank you. And one last question. You made a comment about choke points across the cryptocurrency, because I think cryptocurrency, it's a common denominator in all ransomware because that's how they get paid. So can you talk a little bit about choke points, how we can improve choke points maybe, and make cryptocurrency harder for people to use?
So I
anonymously?
I think the way I would characterize it is you have points of leverage where the cryptocurrency economy intersects with the conventional economy. It's kiosks, it's over the counter exchange desks, it's exchanges. Anytime that you're taking Bitcoin, you're buying Bitcoin or trading it out, those are areas that you can actually say, look, you have to comply with financial regulations, know your customer, anti-money laundering. The task force does a fantastic job of laying out some of those issues. The thing we have to be careful about is that cryptocurrency is one of those technologies that has crossed the threshold, in my view. It's here to stay. In fact, there are other emerging areas. In China, cryptocurrency is way, way, way ahead of where we are in the U.S., and it very likely is going to be, the future of financial transactions. So rather than cut it off and strangle it, we need to figure out how to get the outcomes we want, positive societal outcomes, while reducing and minimizing. And I think that's the area that Congress needs to spend a lot of time policy-wise thinking about.
Okay. Thank you very much.
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Thank you for your questions, Mr. Clyde. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Rice.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I do hope that we take the recommendations that the Ransomware Task Force made and incorporate it into some kind of legislation as quickly as possible, because what I'm hearing from both sides of the aisle during this hearing is that the recommendations are good, especially, the making the United States lead by example and execute a sustained, aggressive, whole of government, intelligence-driven anti-ransomware campaign that's coordinated by the White House in the 4 ways that the 3 ways that they mention, because that's critical. We have to have one mission and we have to have a specific way to execute that. Mr. Krebs, just a couple of questions I'd like to direct to you. There were 560 ransomware attacks on U.S. healthcare facilities in 2020 in the middle of this pandemic. I'm sure that you would qualify healthcare facilities as critical infrastructure. I'd just like to get your opinion on what we can do to ensure, and by the way, the pandemic, I think, made clear that there is a fundamental connection between strong public health infrastructure and strong national security. So I want your thoughts on that. In my district in 2019, as part of an attack that targeted several school districts around Long Island and New York, 2 school districts in my district were targeted by cyber criminals and had all of their data held for ransom. One district had all of its data backed up offline and didn't need to make the ransom payment to the attackers. But unfortunately, the other was forced to pay nearly $100,000 to regain access to its data. I guess maybe going back to, do you criminalize the payment of ransomware? But also, is there best practices that say school districts, like one of them knew to keep this stuff offline, the other did not and had to make the payment? What are your thoughts on that? And also, I just really want to get into the cryptocurrency issue again. I mean, we've been talking about this in all my years on Homeland Security, talking about cryptocurrency and the use of cryptocurrency by terrorists, but now it is becoming much more daily accepted and daily used form of payment for not just terrorists, but here we are with ransomware. And as you say, every day in China, and it's going to become much more ubiquitous. So your thoughts on that as well?
Okay, so there's Bitcoin, there's schools, and there's hospitals.
Yes.
On the hospitals point, in the middle of COVID, your number of 560, that's at least what we know. One of the biggest problems we have right now in cybercrime and ransomware specifically is we don't actually know, we don't have confidence and granularity on the actual denominator, because there's a lot of lack of reporting. So we need to work through how do we get a better fidelity on the numbers of actual victims. And so the ransomware task force has some recommendations on requirements for paying for ransom. The second, on schools, I think this is an opportunity for CISA and the Department of Education, both at the federal and the individual state levels, to work together to develop best practice and guidance. I think that's underway over the last several months to pull that together. And lastly, happy to come in and bring some experts in to talk about Bitcoin, but this is, or cryptocurrency rather, more broadly. Again, we need to think about, boosting innovation and reducing the harms. Last point I want to make here, though, is that based on my experience in leading CISA, the budget process and the appropriations process is critically important on seeking the outcomes that you want as Congress. When you dedicate specific resources sufficiently to tackle a problem, for instance, election security, then that allows us to put surge resources to that problem. So if ransomware is a priority, then you need to think about what is it going to take from a unit type cost perspective to achieve the outcomes you want, so that there can be hiring, there can be certainty in contracting, there can be other resources acquired and brought in. I'm telling you right now, the approach we took to election security is but one of the critical infrastructure sectors. In fact, one of 55 national critical functions. It required a significant amount of focus and personnel and resources, but it can be repeated. We can repeat that same model to counter ransomware. But again, you can't just say, hey, you guys have to do this now out of your existing budget. We have to put resources against it, and it will get done. I promise you that.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And I want to thank all of the witnesses here today, because with brain trusts like you helping legislators like us, I don't know how we can't get this done. We just have to get behind it in a nonpartisan way and get the job done. Madam Chairman, I yield back. Thank you so much.
I thank the gentlelady, and let me just address an issue to remind members that pursuant to House rules, members are required to be on camera when recognized during committee proceedings. Members may be allowed to participate without video where they are having technical difficulties. Having said that, I'd like to now recognize for 5 minutes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, for 5 minutes, and also inform colleagues that we will likely have a second round of questions for our witnesses. So those of you who may have additional questions, there will be a second round following Mr. Torres. Mr. Torres, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. According to Cybersecurity Ventures, the cost of cybercrime has been on an exponential curve from $3 trillion in 2015 to a projected $6 trillion in 2021 to a projected $10.5 trillion in 2025. According to Third Way, almost all cybercrime goes unpunished, with less than 1% resulting in enforcement action. My first question concerns prevention, and it's directed toward Mr. Krebs. In your professional judgment, would protective DNS services be effective at preventing most ransomware breaches?
most ransomware breaches. I think that's hard to say. I think it would certainly be an effective way to detect malware on a network and help minimize any sort of further compromise.
And what about the efficacy of multi-factor authentication?
Oh, I mean, that's table stakes. This is one of the biggest problems right now that we're seeing, I think, in state and local communities. I'd love to hear Mr. Goulet's perspective, but some of these state and local organizations, tribal and territorial as well, don't have the resources to shift off of some of their legacy systems and don't have the staff to implement a multi-factor authentication regime. They rely on single-factor authentication like passwords that are easily brute force, password sprays, things like that. I think we need to give them the resources to make that shift, but we also need to put additional pressure on some of the technology companies that are providing the services and say, look, MFA by multi-factor authentication by default has to be the new normal.
I have a quick question about reporting. If a federal contractor were to make a ransom payment using federal funds, would the contractor be required to report the incident to the federal government?
I am not clear right now on some of the financial or the federal acquisition regulation requirements on that, but I mean, if it's not, they certainly should.
You know, it seems to me that the scandal is not only that we're failing, but in many ways we're not even trying. Most state and local governments have no separate line item for cybersecurity, which tends to be buried in the larger IT budget. My understanding is that state and local governments on average dedicate only 1 to 3% of their IT budget on cybersecurity. In your estimation, what percentage of a state or local government's IT budget should go towards cybersecurity?
Percentages of overall IT spend dedicated to cybersecurity is a metric that sometimes gets thrown around as a good way to measure. I don't think it's all the time always that helpful, because you could spend 15% of your budget on stuff that doesn't do anything for you. So it's about, are you investing in the right things, like multi-factor authentication? I think for state and local, I think getting to the cloud, getting off of your on-premises Exchange servers, segmentation of your networks, recovery, incident response planning, and exercises. I think those are 4 or 5 of the things that I would put a lot of focus on.
And I know the task force on ransomware has put forward 48 recommendations. I suspect many of those recommendations are familiar proposals that have been percolating for a long time. I'm curious to know what historically has been the greatest barriers to the implementation of those recommendations and what can be done to break down those barriers. And this question is for both General Davis and Megan Stifel.
Thank you, Congressman. I'll go first while Megan is considering her response. There are a lot of good things that are out there that exist today. I think part of the problem, though, is that, number one, I was in the Prepare working group. I was a co-chair in that working group as well. And what we came to the conclusion was that for a variety of reasons, organizations, especially the smaller ones, both in public and private, the private sector, were either unaware of, or there was a failure to adopt them for a number of reasons. And that's why in my opinion, one of the biggest recommendations that we made was to come up with this framework, this internationally accepted, accessible, practical framework of the best practices that exist out there today, so that this information can be made available. In terms of adoption, part of the challenge with adoption was the aspect of, especially at a smaller organizational level, when you only have so many dollars, it seems that most of the business decision making is done concerning availability when it comes to information systems and not security. And so part of the recommendations we made was also to get after that audience of business decision makers, to arm them with the information that would enable them to make better risk management decisions put in the context of the business and not simply IT decisions. And then just from a general perspective, I think a lot of the reason why some of the good things that are out there just aren't adopted as widespread as they could be is the fact that it's been stovepiped and piecemeal, and there's a lot of noise that needs to be sifted through. So I think our approach is this full court press, with, all of the required participants in order to solve some of those challenges.
I'm happy to respond. I know that the time has expired, but I would agree.
Yes.
Really, sorry, Congresswoman.
Yes, the gentleman's time has expired, and we are going to enter into a second round of questioning. So I just wanted to, if you would just hold your comments, and you can probably tack it on in response to some additional questions. I now recognize myself for the beginning of a second round of questioning. My next question goes to General Davis and you, Ms. Stiefel. The Ransomware Task Force report observes that there is a lack of reliability, representative data about ransomware scope and scale. DHS has long worked to incentivize cyber information sharing with somewhat mixed results. How can the federal government best incentivize state, local, and private sector entities to share timely, actionable information about ransomware incidents?
Madam Chairwoman, I'll be brief since I hogged the last question and didn't give Megan a chance to answer. But I'll just say that from the perspective of the task force, information sharing, threat intelligence sharing, and information sharing was seen as absolutely critical, and that there's a lot of good work that's been done, especially with the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015. And all we're recommending is that be reviewed with an eye towards ransomware specifically. And there are some new indicators of compromised and contextual information specifically around ransomware that we believe can be integrated into the existing regimes to make improvements where required.
Ms. Stiefel, your impressions? And I know you wanted to jump on to the last question.
So first, I would say, with respect to information sharing, agree with John that a great deal of work has been gone into and been successful in enhancing that capacity over the past 5 years. Still, I think there's an opportunity for enhanced awareness around the importance of this information, especially as it relates to ransomware, but also of the incentives, so to speak, that are offered to entities that do share information with the government. I think there's still hesitance, and that can be reduced through a range of opportunities, including by members of the panel with me, in highlighting the value of sharing information. On the last piece, I think the part of the challenge relates to knowing that there's a strategy and improving the ability, again, back to highlighting the real threat that ransomware has become, and ensuring that the available resources that exist are known to entities that need them when they need to respond to them, as well as to help better prepare them.
Very well. Thank you for your response. Mr. Goulet, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted how dependent we are on technology across government and business. In particular, we saw how underinvestment in state IT budgets strained the ability of Americans to access certain programs, such as enhanced employment benefits. How has the pandemic affected states' risk to ransomware, and how could a ransomware attack impact a state's ability to distribute federal benefits to residents?
Well, thank you. Well, with what I call the diaspora, with all the people, moving home to work early last year, the attack surface for any cyber attack just massively increased because of, where basically people's home networks became part of our state networks as part of that. And really the criticality of these systems became so much more important, particularly our unemployment systems or our case management systems we're using for contact tracing and vaccinations. So, the extra effort and impact of we can imagine. In fact, we had sent out a special message to all employees in New Hampshire early in COVID saying, don't be the one that clicks on a link and takes down our unemployment system. I would also like
Absolutely.
to comment on the multi-factor authentication that came up earlier. Many states are implementing that. It is a financial challenge for many states, but it is an absolutely critical, especially for systems that are where administrative access, for those administrative access accounts, it's absolutely critical that multi-factor authentication be implemented.
Very well. Thank you very much. And Ms. Stiefel, you mentioned in your testimony that 70% of ransomware attacks in the fourth quarter of 2020 involved the threat to release data in what some call double extortion ransomware. That is a startling change from the traditional ransomware practice of just denying access to data or networks. What do you think is driving this change? How does this additional threat shape victims' behavior, such as their willingness to pay a ransom? And how have these threats increased the impact that ransomware has on victim organizations?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. It's a great question. I would say there are a number of factors that are influencing this shift. The first is that in some cases, really, I think it was in about 20% of cases, ransom payments were being made. And so the need to and the fear that private information, particularly if it's intellectual property, might be hacked and dumped online can incentivize criminals to try and take this this approach, thinking that they're more likely to get paid. Similarly, the fact that in many cases now organizations have backups, may not be fully comprehensive, but we heard the story earlier, hearing about one school system being able to restore from backups and the other not. That can also frustrate criminals, and so they need to pivot to an alternative business model to try and continue to fund their malicious activities. The third, I think, is really that this the ability for criminals to, where victims are not making clear that they've been the victim of an incident, by dumping the information, they're demonstrating their prowess, so to speak. So really, I think that one of the things that people need to think about as they're working to mitigate and prevent these types of activities is the utility of encryption and encrypting data at rest and in transit, so that where files where an actor gains access to the network, they are still limited in their ability, along with segmentation, which Chris mentioned, in their ability to gain access to these essential files.
I thank you, and I've gone over time, so let me now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, for his questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman, for the second round. I appreciate it. Quickly, Ms. Stiefel, you mentioned mini CRRFs in your opening statement, cyber response and recovery funds. Yet the ransomware report states that only about 1/3 of affected companies pay the ransom. What would prevent a company that was never planning to pay the ransom from applying for, free money from the government to rebuild? Does this effectively take away the incentive for private sector to modernize and securitize their systems? They know the government will pick up the tab. Should there be some sort of cost-sharing arrangement, in your opinion?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, the task force recommends that not just a blank check, so to speak, be offered to entities that are applying to receive assistance through the cyber response and recovery funds, but in fact that there be some set of criteria after which they might be able to access the funds. So in the case of the task force, the example was once a framework is developed that identifies practices that could be undertaken to better prevent ransomware victimization in the first place, demonstration of compliance with or the ability to meet the suggestions in the framework be one doorway through which an organization might access the funds.
Thank you very much. And this is both for General Davis and Ms. Stiefel. You both participated, both co-chairs of the task force. I believe one of the priority recommendations advocates for know your customer and other requirements on cryptocurrency exchanges. Can each of you expand on that recommendation? And if there's time, Mr. Krebs, maybe you want to jump in as well.
Thank you, Congressman. I'll go ahead and start, but obviously the recommendation is that what we found from a task force perspective was that ransomware crime should be more closely regulated, and governments should require cryptocurrency exchanges, the crypto kiosks, the over-the-counter trading desk to comply with existing laws. And those were the ones including know your customer, anti-money laundering, and combating financing of terrorism. In our view, those are good laws. They're just not effectively and consistently implemented in all cases. And greater oversight in the ability to enforce those, we believe would actually put a dent in this problem.
I would just build a bit on what John said to highlight the importance of the information that can be gathered through these types of requirements. Those can not only facilitate the investigation of the crime itself, but also additional preventative measures that law enforcement and others can take in trying to, again, deter the number of ransomware attacks. And
Mr. Krebs, is there anything additional?
I think that covers the fair share of it. I think what we have to focus on is increased, and I can't believe I'm saying this right now, but increased information sharing around not personal information, but victim wallets, to the extent that we can get better fidelity on the size and scope of this issue and where the funds are going to light up those aggregation points throughout the economy, the cryptocurrency economy, that allow us to take further directed action against the criminals.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, all. And one just final question for anyone. Are you aware of companies doing the right thing, having backups, doing what I explained before, but it being more expensive to do the right thing than actually paying the ransom? Anybody have any stories on that?
So I, just out of personal experience, at least in the last several months, we've had a number of conversations with companies that have ultimately decided they could either rebuild or recover or ultimately somehow not have to pay. And the reasons for that are going to vary from not wanting to contribute and otherwise.
Okay. All right. If nobody else has anything else to add, I yield back. Thank you, Chairwoman.
I thank the ranking member. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee, are you with us? Ms. Jackson Lee? Well, it appears that she's indisposed, and you all have been wonderful in giving of your time today.
Madam Chair, this is Jim Langevin, if it's possible to ask another question.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. To the gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized now for 5 minutes, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate, again, you holding this hearing and the time and the testimony of our witnesses. So let me go to Ms. Stiefel. In your testimony and and in the task force report, you referenced the importance of the FBI cyber assistant legal attachés or ALATs. The Solarium Commission, on which I had served, has also recommended substantially increasing these positions to help coordinate international cyber criminal investigations. Can you elaborate on why these positions are so important from your perspective?
thank you, Congressman. As an alum of the Department of Justice, I particularly appreciate the question. So the ALATs are really the eyes and ears of the law enforcement community overseas, and they work very closely with their host country counterparts. So in the first instance, they're there to help facilitate investigations of criminal activity that has occurred against U.S. citizens. But they're also there as an extension of our policy approach to law enforcement activity, including our support for the Budapest Convention, which is otherwise known as the Cybercrime Convention. So they're there not only collecting evidence also training local host country staff, but further extending the policy approach of ensuring that there are administrative as well as substantive laws on the books that criminalize malicious activity and unauthorized access to computer networks, and the ability to bring these perpetrators to justice. So in some cases, they may be working through mutual legal assistance activities necessary in order to further an investigation. Of course, they're also providing assistance potentially from the U.S. side, where U.S. companies may be involved in a host nation's investigation of an activity. But I think it's also crucial to note that we don't have as many of these as probably could be most effective particularly for purposes of combating ransomware. So I would encourage additional support for ALATs, as the Solarium Commission has also recommended. And thank you for the question.
You bet. I like how you phrase that there, the eyes and ears of law enforcement on the international front, if I heard that right. And I couldn't agree more. And right now, I think there are too few of them, and we really need to have more. So thank you for that. I think there's only, people may be surprised to know, I think there's only 12 of them right now. 12 is not enough. We need more. Let me go back to General Davis, if we could. We've talked in the past about the proliferation of crime as a service, and it's very disturbing to me, certainly as it is to others. When you look at the ransomware ecosystem and the business model, what do you view as the critical functions to the disruption of which would cause maximum pressure on the criminals?
Thank you, Congressman Langevin. I would, first of all, I would say that once again, this is a full court press, and that happens to be one of the pressure points. And looking more deeply at that pressure point, I know the task force investigated the ability to disrupt the payment process, and it was seen as a critical choke point. The infrastructure associated with the ransomware model and the threat actors themselves. I think it takes all three of those, and there are specific recommendations along the line of each of those three aspects of putting pressure on the act itself, the criminal enterprise. I do think that in the notion of going after the infrastructure, there is an enormous role that private industry can play, and has proven to be able to play in certain instances that are very current, for example. And so I think this notion of a national level joint ransomware task force that involves, White House-led effort with the appropriate interagency and the new National Cyber Directorate in coordination with existing organizations like NCI, JTF, and the JICPO, that is very important. But to get after some of these infrastructure-related disruptions, you're going to need to leverage the hub, the private industry hub that we have also made as a recommendation as a part of that overall whole of society effort.
Thank you, General. And Mr. Krebs and Ms. Stiefel, the task force recommends developing target lists of ransomware developers and other linchpins of the business model. Are there reasons the government isn't doing this already, or ways that we could help make it more effective?
So I'll try to keep this short, but look, the intelligence community, law enforcement community have, just like everybody else, a limited set of resources, and then a separate set of priorities that they have to work against. And so I think what's needed here is let's elevate ransomware and ransomware as a service in the priority list. Now, something's going to get bumped down unless we give them more people and more money to get through this. But I do think that that there is a realization in the IC that ransomware sponsored by countries like Russia is a priority. We were able to prioritize counter ransomware, at least from an elections perspective. I think there's a broader effort we can do here.
Thank you. Ms. Stiefel, anything?
No, I agree with Chris.
Okay, very good. I see my time's expired, Madam Chair. Thank you for the indulgence, and I yield back. Thank our witnesses.
With that, I do thank our witnesses as well, General Davis, Ms. Stiefel, Mr. Krebs, and Mr. Boulay, for your forthright answers today. as well as your indulgence in our second round of questioning. And I thank our members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, the committee record shall be kept open for 10 days, and hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you, everyone, and have a blessed